the Executive Director of the Internet Society's New York chapter, where among other things, I'm tasked with programming events for our community. At the Internet Society, we believe that the Internet is for everyone, and we support efforts to promote the Internet as a positive tool to benefit all people throughout the world. Helping to preserve our digital bits is a natural fit for ISOC in order to ensure that the information we create now will be accessible to future generations and that the Internet continues to be a beneficial tool for our global society. I see our focus, especially at the New York chapter, to be at the intersection of technology, business, and civic engagement. Because of that, our chapter is perfectly positioned to launch the digital preservation campaign with the following goals: to bring awareness to the multi-layered issues surrounding preserving our digital data, to educate users on the importance of digital preservation, and to engage the community, both local and global, to help come up with feasible solutions. So far, we have two wonderful events planned. The first today is presented in partnership with the Greater Washington, D.C. Internet Society chapter, also known as ISOC-DC. And today we're focusing on the policy aspects of digital preservation. Our next event is on February 5th in the evening in New York City. I hope you all can attend. I know it's a little bit away. And Vint Cerf has generously agreed to keynote that one as well. And we'll be focusing that discussion on business models and financial incentives. We'd like to have a few more events throughout 2018, addressing other themes such as technological challenges and solutions, legal challenges, art and culture, and possibly even indigenous issues that's come up in a couple of emails. However, we know that the topic of digital preservation is certainly not new, and there are already a lot of very capable folks and organizations working hard at this. We are certainly not looking to reinvent the wheel, and we certainly can't do this alone. So if you're working on digital preservation, we'd love to talk to you and partner with you to make this something that the larger community is not only aware of, but that they're also inclined to start working on some of these solutions in whatever capacity they can, whether that's creating an appetite amongst everyday users for solutions or incentivizing businesses to come up with those solutions. We're very proud to have Google join as a member, and we certainly need more organizations to join and help. So visit digitalpreservationnow.com to learn more and get in touch, and also feel free to speak to me after the event. On that note, I'd like to thank Google for hosting us here today. A big thanks to Denise Kelly and Carla Lefevre for helping put this all together. You both have been wonderful. Thank you, Vint, for making yourself available and for speaking. And a special thanks to Rick Witt for being a tremendous resource on digital preservation, as well as a great sounding board. He's also written an extremely informative white paper on the topic, which helped me learn quite a bit. It's available for download. I highly recommend you guys read it. It's available for download on the site digitalpreservationnow.com. So we have a fantastic discussion lined up today. Following Vint Cerf's talk, we're very lucky to have two respondents who have a deep background in digital preservation. Kate Zwaard, who is the Chief of National Digital Initiatives at the Library of Congress, where she directs LC Labs, which incubates innovative digital projects and enables computational analysis of digital collections. And we also have Michelle Wu, who is the Associate Dean for Library Services and Professor at Law at Georgetown University Law Center. After that, we'll open it up to audience participation, as I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and comments. I should also note that the event is being live streamed, and we'll be taking remote questions at the end as well. So if you're so inclined, please use the hashtag digital preservation. And now it's time for me to introduce someone who does not need an introduction. It is a really great pleasure to have Vint Cerf here with us today. We all know him as one of the fathers of the internet, and he is certainly someone who is passionately concerned about the internet we're handing down to future generations, which is why it's no surprise that he cares so much about avoiding a looming digital dark age. He's not only one of the fathers of the internet, but also a founder of the Internet Society, so on so many levels, it's very fitting that we have him speak with us today. So enough for me. Please give a warm welcome to Vint Cerf.
Took care of all kinds of introductions, so I was going to draw attention to Rick Witt's work. Rick is working with me and several other people at Google on a little project we call Digital Vellum. I think the important, and I also wanted to draw attention to Larry Landweber, who's the former chair of the Internet Society. There are probably other folks here who deserve introduction, but what I would suggest is that when we get into a serious discussion, you might just introduce yourselves briefly to say why you're here and maybe what brings you here. I'd like to suggests that we break this discussion up into three parts, not with regard to time, but rather with regard to topic. The first topic with regard to digital preservation is the technical one. We know that bits are not ethereal little things. They actually have to be embedded in some physical representation. And those physical devices don't necessarily have an infinite lifetime. And so one obvious problem with regard to preserving digital information is the need to recopy the digital information from one medium to another as the media come and go. And go they do. Every one of you, I'm sure, knows that about the 8-inch Wang disks for the word processors or the 5 1/4-inch floppy disks for some of the IBM PCs and the Apple II machines. I still have a few 5 1/4-inch floppies, and I certainly have a bunch of 3 1/2-inch floppies. And I actually found a 3 1/2-inch floppy reader that I picked up on eBay, which you could plug in with a USB to a current Macintosh. And so I pulled the little 3 1/2-inch disc, put it in. I actually read it. The little file directory popped up, and lo and behold, I had a whole bunch of WordPerfect files. Except I didn't have anything that was running WordPerfect in that particular Macintosh. So the idea that you have to keep renewing the bits as new technology comes along is important. There's also an issue about longevity of the medium. Some of the polycarbonate discs, for example, the CDs that we were all excited about because they had 700 megabytes of data on them, may not last more than a decade or so before they start losing their content. Magnetic tape is another big challenge. We still use magnetic tape, by the way, at Google for tertiary and storage. These are 25 terabyte cassettes that are read using robotic storage systems. But those have to be recopied from time to time, and eventually, as new technology comes along, we'll have to copy all of that stuff into new media. So there's the obvious thing that we would have to do to preserve digital content. But the comment about WordPerfect is the more critical problem from my point of view, and that has to do with the ability to keep running old software in order to interpret old files. And for most of the people in this room, I don't need to outline what those problems are. Not all digital objects are static. So you can imagine storing things away and even printing things if they are in fact static, like images or text or things of that sort. But when they are interactive, like a spreadsheet, you clearly need to be able to run the software that provides that interaction, or video games and other kinds of things. So we need to be able to preserve the ability to run the old software. And some people will say, well, why don't you just make everything backward compatible? And the answer to that is it doesn't work. Sometimes it gets very, very hard to create new technologies and new mechanisms and make them all fully compatible with previous designs. And so we end up with, I end up anyway, with the belief that we will have to be able to run old software in many cases in order to make use of the old digital data. But that leads to another problem, because the software typically ran in an operating system environment. And that means I have to be able to run old operating systems to run the old applications. And it gets worse because those operating systems may have been designed to run in a particular hardware environment. And so it's easy to imagine in the end having to emulate the old hardware, perhaps in the cloud somewhere, in order to run the operating system, to run the application in order to correctly interpret the old files. So we have a whole series of technical challenges associated with preserving digital content. My biggest concern is preservation over long periods of time. So I'm not talking about the next 10 years or the next 20. I want to talk about 100 or 200 or 300 years. And you might say, well, why do you care about that? And the answer is we have other information which has been preserved for more than 1,000 or 2,000 years, and it's been useful to have that information. And so to imagine that the digital information won't have utility over that long period of time simply flies in the face of reason. I'm not arguing, however, that all digital information will have utility for 100 years or 1,000 years. Anyone who watches Twitter or reads Twitter or something knows that there's a lot of that. It probably won't be of much interest other than maybe titillating moments 1,000 years from now. But there is an important point to be made here, and people will say, well, surely you don't mean that we should preserve everything. And of course not, I don't. We can't. We can barely contain the World Wide Web as it is. We can't literally copy the entire World Wide Web and continue to copy it as it continues to evolve, although that's what Brewster Kahle is attempting at the Internet Archive, and he's not so naive as to think you can copy everything either. But he's trying to make a good attempt at capturing as much as he can manage. That's a function of cost and how much memory he has available and how long that memory will last. But my biggest concern here is that if someone decides that they want to save something for their reasons, that there should be capability to do that. And that's really what I'm after. I'm after the standards and the technology that will allow someone to say, this is something I wish to preserve over a long period of time. I want the wherewithal to do that. And so that's part of the target of the Digital Vellum project, is to work your way through how to make that possible. Now, having said all of that, there are some non-technical issues that have to be dealt with. One obvious one is standards, which I guess have a technical component to them. But the next element has to do with intellectual property. A lot of the material that we might want to preserve for future use has constraints on access for periods of time. In the case of copyright material, under the current Berne Convention, it's 70 years, I guess, plus after the death of the author. So that could be potentially over 100 years. So that's one problem. At what point can the preserved information be made accessible and under what conditions? So we'd have to record that metadata in order to make sure that the copyright rights are properly observed. Same argument may arise with regard to patents. If there are software patents associated with software, whether it's the application or the operating system or the hardware, we also have some questions about who is allowed to practice the patent and under what conditions until that patent expires and it becomes available in the public domain. So we have an intellectual property question to deal with, and it's been my belief that it will be important to establish ground rules, laws, maybe legislated ground rules, that will allow a digital preservation authority to have access to content and privileges that might not otherwise be conferred. So for example, if I'm running a digital preservation system on the cloud somewhere, it would be nice to have the right to allow third parties to execute old software, even if patent rights are still applying, or even if copyright still applies, in order to make the software usable. So the people who have invested in its use to create digital objects will not lose the use of those digital objects. So the question is how to compose the legislation to allow that to happen without necessarily doing damage to otherwise reasonable intellectual property constraints. And then there's the final problem, which is how the heck do you build a business model that will allow you to preserve information for hundreds of years? And the first thing that comes to my mind is what institutions have even lasted that long? And there are a few cases that I can tick off, right? There's the breweries, some of which are 500 years old, and wineries, which are sometimes several hundred years old. And then there's the Catholic Church, which is at least 2,000 years old, and which has had a role to play in preservation, I might point out, during the Middle Ages, especially, where monks were copying things on vellum. So I haven't been able to figure out, however, how to link any of those business models with digital preservation, but I've been drinking a lot in the course of trying to figure it out. So there is a real question there about what that looks like. Now, I can tell you that here it is, it's January 2018. An acquaintance of mine has started a company he calls eMortal, and it's all about how to preserve family information, whether it's photographs or letters or documents of importance, over long periods of time. He's not so much focused on the technical problem, although he's built a system to do this. He was focused on what's the business model that will allow this long-term preservation to happen. Then he's decided that the best way to do this is to follow the life insurance plan. Life insurance has this very interesting property that when you buy a life insurance policy, you keep paying for it until you're dead. I don't know of very many other products that have that property to them. I mean, it's really an amazing deal. And so his idea was to create a digital insurance policy which preserves your digital content after you die. And of course, that's what life insurance, they don't call it death insurance, even though that's what it is, because you'd never sell it if you were trying to sell somebody a death insurance policy. You can imagine what that skit would look like on Saturday Night Live or something. But think about a life insurance policy pays your heirs. And so a digital insurance policy or digital life insurance policy preserves information for your heirs. And the question is, well, how does that work? And basically the answer is you pay, in addition to the life insurance policy, this little adjunct fee, which goes into a fund which will support the cost of maintaining the digital content. So we won't know, of course, whether this idea works until his business gets going. Literally, he's running early tests with a few insurance companies beginning this month in the UK. So those are the three major parts: the intellectual property question, the business model question, and the technical question. Now, there are people in this room who have already been exposed to and are working in the space. And so my hope in this is that this is a conversation and a discussion. That's why I don't have any slides. My favorite expression is power corrupts, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. I'm not using slides. I want to incite discussion, INCITE, and I want from the discussion insight, INSIGHT. So you're here because you're interested in the topic, and you're here because you're supposed to contribute to our understanding of what's possible. And from my point of view, I don't care whether we focus only on the technical side of things or whether we explore all the three areas that I think are sufficient to cover the topic. You may actually know that there are some other things that are not covered by those three, in which case we should get those on the table as well. So I promised I wouldn't go on for more than 10 or 15 minutes. I think I've more than done that. So my proposition now is to find out whether anyone wishes to pick on any of those three topics, or a fourth one that I didn't think of, in order to start the discussion. And so I'm going to pause and see whether we have anybody escalating out of their the chair. There's one already. We need microphones. So can we have? Normally we deliver them with drones, but
I'll be the drone.
you're the mobile drone. Would you please introduce yourself before you make your comment or question?
Yes, my name is Joel Hetker, retired federal government. And
you're a recovering Fed, okay?
Right.
All right.
I read recently that the 21st century, there may be a digital dark age, that we will know more about the 20th century
That's correct.
than we know about the 21st
We've
century.
already discovered, for example, that by scanning books from the don't take that away. The 19th century books are out of copyright now, and so Google scanned a lot of them. And what I watched, interestingly enough, is how many references suddenly emerged in the literature for those books that people hadn't been able to see for 100 years or 75 years, suddenly coming to light. So the answer is, my big worry is that the 22nd century will know very little about the 21st, given all of our heavy dependence on digital technologies. And so I am very worried about that. Do you have any thoughts about what we should do?
Well, here's a little joke. We had Y2K because back in the 60s when memory was very expensive and we had 2 digits. So they get all the COBOL programmers to...
That's right.
What are they going to do in 8,000 years when they have to go to from 9,999 to 10,000?
Okay, actually, funny that you should bring this up. I have an anecdote. You understand, when you get past a certain age, all you ever do is tell anecdotes. So I reached that. I was having dinner with Alan Greenspan in late 1999 in Florida. We were at some conference together. And he confessed to me that in his salad days, he was a COBOL programmer. And so as Y2K was about to hit anyway, I said, well, Alan, why didn't you put 4 digits in instead of 2? And he made all of the excuses you did. But he added one more. He said, besides, this was the 1950s, and we didn't think any of our software would still be running 50 years from then. Of course, we've been running emulations. So talk about digital preservation. The emulation of old hardware over periods of IBM became incredibly skilled at this with the 360 series. They would run emulations of the 1401s and the 7044s and the 7094s, and it was incredible. And sometimes it was simulations of simulations of or emulations of emulations of emulations. So that was Alan's comment about Y2K. All right, so what else? There's one over here. Again, don't forget to introduce yourself.
Thank you. So I'm Bill Cunningham. I'm an unaffiliated member of Noralo with ICANN, but I'm also an economist. So the issue that I want to talk about is this business model issue, which is exactly wrong. I think it's exactly
we shouldn't
wrong.
be talking about
No. You can't use a for-profit type of model when you're looking at this type of social return. Remember what the issue is with the business model. It does not incorporate social return. So you can't really calculate what the social return is from having some word star file in 200 years, which, might contain some answers, whatever. And this is what the Catholic Church had realized. This is why they copied all that stuff. There's not a business model that you use to justify those decisions. There is a social return model that you use. And when you're talking social return, the only institutions that humans have developed that have a consistent track record in increasing social return has been governments. So to me, the solution is simple. No, move away from the profit stuff. Why are you even focusing? It's not going to work. It didn't work for mortgages. It didn't work for markets. It's not going to work for this stuff. So you need to focus on the public side.
To take this up, which I think is a well-made point, there are these institutions called libraries. You might have heard of them. They have things in them called books, among other things. And they have, in fact, performed precisely the function that you described. I remember having a meeting like this one. Some of you have heard this anecdote. It was mostly librarians, and we were talking about the problem of digital preservation. And in the course of a discussion like this one, some young fellow got up and said, digital preservation isn't a problem. The stuff that isn't worth anything will be lost and nobody will care, and the important stuff will be preserved. And it took me half an hour to get the librarians off the ceiling, because they pointed out that sometimes you didn't know for a couple of hundred years that this particular piece of information was actually key to understanding some important event in history, and therefore you had to be careful to save as much as you could. So the point's very well taken.
And I wanted to jump in since you made that point. That's the issue with Twitter. That's why you need to keep everything that's on Twitter. Because 100 years from now, there'll be some small tweet, not Donald's tweets, but there'll be some tweet from somebody that you don't know that will be this just brilliant insight that changes everything. And the other issue is pattern recognition. The issue with the data, like a high-frequency database like Twitter, is that, no, the individual units are atoms. They don't really matter. What we'll see in about 100 years is that the pattern, there'll be certain patterns that emerge from the data, which we are unaware of right now.
Well, we actually have good work examples of that. If you look at Google Trends, for instance, you get some idea of what is the topic of discussion. Did the topic go up and down? Were there correlated events like some newspaper article or some particular catastrophe or what have you that generated interest in that? So the point's well taken. Okay, other comments? Here's one here, and then we'll get you number two. Would you like me to run around with the microphone, or is this your health plan?
This is my steps for the day.
Hello, David Lesher. I guess to adopt your line, I'm a recovering engineer. And
I haven't recovered yet. But
okay, well, I'm still working on it. It's a day-by-day process. You sort of medged into this, but you mentioned the Catholic Church, and you didn't mention the other institution that's important, our educational institutions.
Yes, good.
Specifically, come to mind a certain one in Boston, and I don't know if you've ever heard Barry Shine's story about why the T didn't end up moving Harvard's wall.
No, what is that story?
Because they showed up at the eminent domain hearing and said, well, we have this piece of paper that exempts us from eminent domain. And the judge says, who gave it to you? And they said, well, George Washington, sir. Here it is.
Wow.
So
That's impressive.
you have to consider them, I think, and that's part of the issue. But and that's sort of, to take a big jump back to technology, our longest lived storage technology is, in fact, ink on acid-free paper.
Yeah, that's correct. And when people ask me what should I do with my photographs that I care most about, I
Yeah.
tell them print it on the best quality paper you can find, because we know that that's preservable at least over 150 years. And that's not true for most of the digital technologies we know about. And it's astonishing how few people fully appreciate this until their storage medium breaks and they didn't back it up. Or worse, they have a storage medium, they're assiduous about backing everything up, and then a new computer comes out with no plug that fits, that little thing, and there's no adapter, and the protocols are different. And then there's the several bad words occur to them at that point. You mentioned domain, and that triggered another thought with regard to preservation, and that is the domain name system. Now, this is very appropriate considering that the Internet Society is hosting this, and Internet has a role to play in the digital environment. Domain names are not persistent. At least they are not assured to be persistent. So when you see URLs in published documents, even though they're printed on paper, if you try to go to the site that's cited, you often get 404 page not found, because the domain name was lost because somebody forgot to pay, or they died and nobody knew they should retain the domain name. Somebody else got the domain name. Now, either the URL doesn't resolve, or worse, it does resolve to something that it wasn't intended to be pointed to in the first place. So we have a serious problem with preserving references. And this is the beginning of a longer thread having to do with metadata associated with digital content. Because it's bits, you really need not only, you need something that says this is the information about the digital information, and we need that to be in digital form so we can read it and find it and understand it and interpret it. We might actually want it to be preserved in other forms too, where maybe you have an index that's printed. But we need references that are in fact persistent. And so there were ideas in the World Wide Web for uniform resource names as opposed to uniform resource locators. The locators have domain names in them. The names do not. However, you still need something to resolve the name. And so you still have to have something that persists, that understands how to go from the name to the place where the referenced information is located. Now, there is a system that Bob Kahn and I worked on 30 years ago, and Bob has continued to work on it, called the Digital Object Architecture. And in that system, the identifiers are intended to be persistent and never reused, never reassigned to anything. Now, the reason that's of interest is partly because of the persistence theory. There's a whole resolution mechanism in place, but of course you have to go to the place where the data is, so it still has to be preserved somewhere. So he has in that architecture repositories that hold the data and the metadata and the indexing that lets you find stuff. What we're seeing, I think, generally, is that there are a lot of different places that are trying to do bits and pieces, no pun intended, of this stuff, but it's not very coherent. And so one of the things that would really help a lot is to try to distill from the conversations that we're having today and the other conversations that go on all the time, some sort of very fundamental architectural principles and some standards to go with it that would allow us to build a resilient and evolvable storage environment to save all of this information. And I don't think we're there yet. I think what we have are various groups that are trying to deal with this problem. There's a group called the International Internet Preservation Consortium. There's another group with the Interplanetary File System. And there are others. I mean, the Internet Archive is another good example. What we don't have, I think, is a coherent and fundamental understanding of what's the minimum required here. In some sense, we need the moral equivalent of an internet protocol that allows everything to communicate with everything else, and we don't have that yet. Okay, this was number 2, and that's number 3.
Bowden Contour from Library of Congress. I'm happy to be here in this conversation. The question that I have and comment about digital preservation is that 1,000 years from now, we as humans will still be analog creatures. We will be reading 14 inches away
Yes.
from our eyeballs, and our ears will be sampling analog information. So when we're going from analog to digital and then digital to analog, how should we be sampling this analog world? You know, there's human resolution of our senses, but then there's also the Nyquist limit. So how do you design a system that is human capable and readable?
Okay, 2 things. First of all, I know that we were planning to have some commentary here, and I eroded that, so I'll try to fix that. Let me actually challenge the assumption. He said 1,000 years from now, we'll all be analog humans. Well, I'm not so sure, actually. The more we play around with genetics and the more we have CRISPR-Cas9 and all these other things, we may actually find ourselves evolving towards sort of a combination of bio and digital technology. My wife is an example. You guys, many of you know this story. My wife lost her hearing when she was 3. She was deaf for 50 years. She got a cochlear implant in 1996. This is a computer that listens to the sound, figures out what frequencies are present with a Fourier transform, then transmits signals up a little wire to a headpiece, which is magnetically connected to the internal implant inside of her head, and decides which electrodes touching her auditory nerves should be stimulated and how in order to fake the brain into thinking that it has a functioning ear. We know well enough about the sensory neural system of hearing to fake it. So this is sort of the beginning of sort of engineering of human beings to connect digital technology to our analog senses. So it could very well be that we could present to a human being digital rendering, which is far in excess of what our normal analog equipment can handle.
Well, point is well taken about the hybrid system, but the question still remains: what sampling rate should we do now so that
the answer is in front of you, in effect. Look at what the movie industry has been doing for the last number of years. They've been going up to higher and higher and higher resolutions. 4K is now old stuff, and now it's going to 8K, 16K. And so it doesn't seem to matter what our analog system is. The engineering people want to keep increasing the total sampling rate and bandwidth and resolution to the point where we can't tell the difference between that and reality. So at least so far, and by the way, it's turned into a big problem for the movie industry. Those people try to preserve the movie materials that they use to produce films, and they've been doing a lot of it digitally. But because the resolution has been going up, they have to redo the storage designs and the encoding schemes every couple of years. And so they have standards for this, and the standards are only guaranteed to be backward compatible for 2 generations. That's all that they're willing to commit to. And so the movie industry has had to not only digitize their older stuff, but copy it under new formats and in new physical equipment in order to retain their archives and make them accessible for future purposes. So the problem is still with us.
Okay, Google.
Yeah, right. Very funny. Larry.
Hi, Larry Landweber, formerly University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I agree the three topics are really important, but I have a more mundane question,
Okay.
which is perhaps out of scope. You and I know a generation of people, all of whom, or many of whom, have boxes of material
Yes.
sitting in their garages or their dens.
I would be one of them, yes.
Right, and many of whom are within a decade of being in independent living or, or worse.
That's a really good point.
And who are concerned with how they're going to preserve it. And so, for example, I work with Doug Gale's Internet Legacy Institute. Doug passed away, but the material is still there. We talked to Babbage, we talked to the computer machine, we talked to universities, and to some extent, all of the places to give these things to are black holes, because there's never a guarantee of curation,
Yes.
of metadata, of having funding so that material would be available. In addition, as I mentioned to you before, I've dealt with both the Johnson Library and the Carter Library. The Carter Library is virtually impossible to track material down.
Wow, and that's from the late
As opposed to the
early
Johnson
80s.
Library, which is wonderful. We were not able to find material we needed in the Carter Library, but could easily Johnson Library. So what are we going to do? We almost need a Manhattan Project to go around and collect this material up. This material is not in digital form. Put it in some kind of reasonable digital form, provide funding somehow to prepare the metadata, the curation, and in the absence of that, it's all going to go away within the next 5 or 10 years.
So that's a very good point. I learned something from some meetings with Carnegie Mellon about the difference between an archive and a library. I hadn't really appreciated the difference. It's sort of like engineers not knowing the difference between marketing and sales. Those are not the same thing. The archive ends up receiving things of arbitrary type. I mean, it's not published material, it's just boxes full of things. Libraries more typically end up with things that have been published material that has at least some provenance to it and other information. Now, if there are librarians in the room who disagree with that, you should say something about that, but that's my going in understanding of a distinction between the two. I only bring that up because the archive is faced with a really serious challenge. It's the one that Larry outlines, and that's how to receive content. Now, I've given some things to the Smithsonian over the years, and one of the things that impressed me is that they would not accept receipt of these things without a substantial amount of documentation about where did this come from and who owned it, what was it used for, what is its vintage, and so on, because they wanted all of that information to be captured. The archive needs that too. So that suggests to me, Larry, that if we were to establish some standards for metadata associated with the collections that you're describing, and if we could instantiate that in a way that makes the digitization and the capture of the metadata a standard practice, then we might actually contribute to solving the problem you're describing.
And the associated funding.
I'm sorry, that is...
And the associated funding.
And the funding, yes, the funding is that's the other big issue. And now, well, we get back to the earlier point, which is that whether the society is willing to spend its either government resources on these things. And with regard to libraries and government, though, can I come back to your point earlier about the government funding at various levels, whether it's state or federal or local? Lending libraries in the U.S. were actually a private sector matter, Andrew Carnegie being the classic example. And so in some very interesting way, it wasn't a business model exactly, but it was a private sector entity that underwrote the cost of getting those libraries built and populating them. So there might still be a role for the private sector to play, but it might not be as a business. It might be a philanthropic role.
And I agree. So I think crowdfunding is probably one of the items that you want to look at to energize that federal movement toward funding. In other words, you want to start out with some billion-dollar crowdfunding campaign that says, run by you, by the way, that says we're going to preserve everything digital, and you'll see how much support you get, that sort of thing. Then you take that support level and you go to these federal governments. You say, well, see, we got 20,000 people to donate $1,000, therefore there's interest, therefore you should kick in another $2 billion, you know. The other thing is
I
that...
like that mathematics. Can I get somebody to do that for my retirement plan? I'll kick in 20,000 and you kick in 20 million. That works great.
That's called Bitcoin. So you want to look at Bitcoin and ICOs, and I got the answer for you. I really do. But the point is that we've moved beyond that level. This is hugely important. This is absolutely huge, and I agree with you. You know, but the private sector simply is incapable of making the long-term calculation that would even get this started. I mean, this should be a no-brainer for Library of Congress or for others, and it is to some extent. You know, I love the Library of Congress, but you know, this is just so important that it shouldn't even be kind of a question in my mind. Just
So actually, I feel compelled at least to defend Google a little bit here, because we in fact did undertake to start digitizing large quantities of material. We made deals with Stanford Library and others, and we began digitizing. And some of you will know the various litigations that ensued for over a period of 10 years or more. And so even a well-meaning attempt to do that didn't come out as well as we had hoped because of people's interests coming into collision with that. I'm concerned about time, and I wonder whether you don't want to get the other commentators to be part of into the program.
Yeah, I actually think that this was a great segue to get Kate Zwaard from the Library of Congress up, since we're talking about libraries, so maybe she could say a few words. Yeah.
That would be you. Okay.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here and to be contributing to this discussion. Unlike Vint Cerf, I do need an introduction. I'm Kate Zwaard from the Library of Congress. How many librarians do I have here? Yes, awesome. That's so great.
Does it count if you have a home library?
I mean, you'd have to ask them. I am not actually a librarian. I'm a software developer, and most of my professional experience has been in developing software for libraries to preserve things. So that's the sort of perspective that I come with. I think of myself as proudly assimilated by libraries, although I'm not a professional librarian. So as you were talking, I just jotted down a couple of notes that I thought might spur additional discussion, and I'm sorry if it's not as coherent as I'd like. It's not a super coherent narrative, but I do want to say that everything decays. And in a certain sense, digital material is not any different from tangible material in that it takes institutions, policies, practices, money to preserve it. We do have some things that have survived 1,000 years, but those are very few and far in between. Even ink printed on acid-free paper molds and fades. My friends here in the back are from the Library of Congress, and they know that we have a huge conservation division, and we have scientists, we have a scanning electron microscope, we have a lot of resources and time that go into preserving the tangible collection. So this, for libraries at least, is not new in the sense that the methodologies are new, but the principles aren't new. So in terms of digital preservation, one of the things that I want to talk about is the scale of information that's available today, and it really ties into funding. We are printing more books than we have ever printed before. So this year, we'll print more books than we printed last year. And last year, we printed more books than ever before. And so what we ask of libraries and archives, all the digital stuff is on top of its traditional mission. So how do we eat the elephant? The canonical answer to that question is bite by bite, but the truth is it's actually impossible because the meat will spoil before you finish, right? You can't eat an elephant. So what's the answer? And the answer in libraries is appraisal. We don't save everything, right? Libraries are not a hole for dropping books into, and they're also not a hole for shoveling bits into. So we decide what we're going to keep. And like you said, sometimes we're wrong about that. Sometimes there's a little piece of information that we didn't realize was going to be important, but we have to make our best guess at the front. My colleague Trevor Owens at the Library of Congress has a book coming out called The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, and the preprint is available for free online. I encourage you to check it out. One of the things he talks about is to embrace and accept the archival sliver. So really go into this knowing that we can't save everything and sort of be okay with that, because that has been true for the history of humanity. In terms of appraisal, and Vint, you mentioned that not all items are static, but for libraries and archives to preserve them, they do need to be. So we have this concept called fixity, right? That we once something's accessioned into the archive, it's accessioned as a snapshot. And that's true for spreadsheets, but it's also true for things that are less obvious, like StoryCorps. So I was a few years ago working on the project to, how many of you are familiar with StoryCorps? We have some NPR listeners in the audience. So StoryCorps is a project to get oral histories from people. And a few years ago, they released an app. So there's an app you can get on your phone to do oral histories, sit at your Thanksgiving table and get your grandmother's history of being in the war. And they donated that to the Library of Congress. So I worked on a project to write the software to accession those items from the API. And talking to the StoryCorps developers, they were talking about us accessioning a stream. But we can't accession a stream, right? We have to accession a fixed thing at a point in time so we can make sure that that's preserved. So for example, they had comments on the stories. But we have to decide, when is that a thing that we're going to have here, right? When does that come into the archive? So fixity is really central to the idea of digital preservation in libraries and archives, I think in a way that's not very obvious. And I was just talking to Leah Prescott about this exact topic, and she was mentioning that the Guggenheim has a policy of born digital art, where the creator is involved in deciding what the item is. So if they are doing a piece of digital art that's displayed on a set of monitors, is the make and model of that monitor part of the art? Is that part of the expression? So in some cases, we have the privilege of being able to interact with the creator when we're deciding what to save. And that's true to a lesser or smaller extent. It's very expensive, right? It's very, that works for the Guggenheim because they have a small number of pieces that they can curate very carefully. That's less true for saving all of the web. We can't really talk to individual creators. So how do we scale? I think, and I'm not really sure how am I doing on time? Okay. I think one of the ways we can scale is using the formats of the web. So the earliest web pages are a quarter century old and they still render. The best bulwark against digital obsolescence is ubiquity in a certain sense. The places where we run into serious problems are in niche areas where the tooling is proprietary. So an example is architectural drawings are really hard. They don't have strong open source tooling. So when you want to open an architectural, so you get your your architectural drawing of your new edition, and I want to open that, I need that piece of software that you used. There's not so the common interchange format is PDF, which obviously flattens out a lot of the things that you need to use. How do we save things? Obviously, we talked a little bit about emulation, which is very expensive. But the benefit of emulation is that it replicates the user experience of using that software. And there are people for whom that is very important. People like Matt Kirschenbaum at the University of Maryland, who's studying the history of Word and how people use technology, and the user experience of, so almost ethnography of technology. But for most of us, we don't need to replicate that experience of using that piece of software. What we need is the information out of it. And I think the analogy in the tangible world is when we scan old material, we can scan it in beautiful color, or we can scan it in really cheap black and white. And beautiful color is a really rich and engaging user experience when you're looking at an old book. You can really get the sense of how yellowed the paper is. But it's expensive to do and it's expensive to store. And black and white gets you pretty great OCR. So that's the difference between sort of emulation and then taking the data out. I think, and this is something that Vint alluded to, we need to think very carefully about what we're preserving it for. What is the target use of the things that we're preserving? So as I mentioned, libraries are not holes for dropping books into. They are places for learning and discovering and creating new knowledge. And so when we acquire things, we do it with the researcher in mind. We do it with a research purpose. And we have to do the same thing with digital information. So it's not enough to save things. You have to save them so that they're useful for specific research purposes. And to give a tangible example of what I'm talking about with this, one of the things that my team at LC Labs is working on is how we can enable computational research of humanities data. So as simple as things that like, showing a map of geocoded prints and photographs. So doing a word count, like doing an analysis of certain word counts in certain types of manuscript collections. So how we preserve the information affects how we'll be able to use it later. So we have a huge web archive collection at the Library of Congress, and that is very useful for looking at the history of web pages. But for example, we save Giphy. So for those of you who are familiar with it, it's a repository of GIFs and memes. And it may not sound important, but there's a lot of meme culture that affects online culture, which affects real culture. But if you wanted to do an analysis of what's the most commonly used word in memes, or who uploaded the most of this type of meme, you really couldn't do that with the web archive because it's not persisted in a file format that makes that type of analysis very doable. So the challenge is, as we're preserving things for a research purpose that is currently evolving. So we're sort of chasing that rabbit in ways that I think are interesting and very exciting. My last point is there a tension between innovation and sustainability? And I think that we usually think there is, but I posit there isn't. And I work in a building that was carved out of marble by revolutionaries. And I think that the antidote in any case is community, which is why I'm so glad to be here with you today. So thank you.
Thank you. So I actually want to respond, if that's okay, with a few observations. One of them, microfilm is apparently, it can be made fairly resilient and reliable over time. And it is one of the examples of an optical format. And there's a lot of belief that if you can do something that will allow you to capture information using optical means, it's likely that optical processing will be available to us, ad infinitum. And so storage media that are optically processed may turn out to be more resilient than conventional digital magnetic media, for example. One of the things that we might keep in mind is that keeping things in more than one form is often very helpful. And for the kinds of analysis and interaction that you were describing, it's wonderful to have these data in an online environment. I know when I stand in my own library at home, I wish that all of the books in the library were also in digital form so I could find the one that I can't remember that has the quote in it that I'm looking for. Then I'll pull the book off the shelf. So optical formats may be our friend there. You mentioned open source, and I think that can be a very powerful tool towards helping us preserve at least some aspects of digital material. There is, on the emulation side, I've run into the following interesting problems. Using current technology to emulate old technology, you often end up with stuff that runs faster than the old stuff did. And so the games that we used to play don't work without artificially slowing the clock down, because otherwise the game runs too fast and the computer wins because you don't ever have time to do anything at all. Also, you run into problems with game consoles, with the 75 little buttons on it. If 100 years from now you wanted to play one of those games, the game console might not exist anymore, and you might have to invent something that allows you to interact in something other than a keyboard. And there's one final thing that has come up in my discussions about the scaling problem, the amount of material, the resolution problem that was raised earlier. And that's to accept the possibility of variable fidelity, that you might deliberately accept a loss of fidelity for some material in order to incorporate more of the material than the highest possible resolution. So those are all things that immediately come to mind. So why don't we get our next commentator up?
So hello, my name is Michelle Wu. My first comment is that I am not a digital preservation specialist. That for Georgetown Law is actually Leah Prescott, who's also in the office here, so I might call on her for some help at certain times. In listening to all the comments in the discussion here, I think I had 4 general comments. And the first is a question to Ben. In terms of the 3 general areas that he's described, I actually think that there might be one more, and that's generally human nature.
I'm sorry, what is it?
It's human nature.
Oh,
so
okay.
even,
Well, I don't know whether that's easily preserved. Shakespeare proved it, right? We still watch his plays because human nature hasn't changed.
So, as a library, I can't tell you how many families, children, grandchildren will find their grandparents, their parents' materials stuffed in their basements, their storage areas, and they donate them to the library. And they have managed to preserve themselves, for lack of a better term, for hundreds of years, or at least decades. And we can still, if we choose to, ingest those into our system. As you're dealing with software or technology, you are dealing with longevity issues and sustainability issues. So if that grandchild finds a floppy disk, even 30 years from now, will it have degraded to the point that it can't be read? So how do you change if we are able to create a mechanism where we can do exactly what Vint says. Any user out there can say, oh, I think this is important. I'll click this button and it will be preserved and maintained forever. How do you actually get the user to do that? How many users can recognize that you need to save something now? And I think that might be the biggest challenge that we're facing is even if we're able to build this entire infrastructure, can we get people to recognize when something should be saved, or at least raised with an authority to ask if it should be saved? So that's my first comment. And my second is, I think, a suggestion on a possible alternative to the Digital Preservation Authority for works under copyright. I agree that there has to be some control over these to give access to entities under certain controlled conditions. But instead of having a single authority, I actually think this might be something that is suited for libraries and a distributed network of libraries across all countries. Because one of the things that I do worry about having an authority make decisions about who can access what is everyone has biases. Even institutions have biases. And if you centralize a source like that, there might be even national biases if we're doing it in the United States. Then what happens if someone wants to preserve something in Germany or something else? Like, what are the decisions that we are going to make? And by distributing that type of control, you do have checks, I think, on that type of bias. And you also have the ability to have alternative sources if that central bias, or if one organization fails you, you can always go to another one. So that would be my second comment. My third is about copyright. So even though publishing has definitely increased over time, I would say that in terms of defining what needs to be preserved, my concern for published materials is obviously the least, because there is already a control mechanism for that. We actually can determine what the full body of that work is. The challenge is in copyright, as Vint has already mentioned. And as it currently stands, as long as we still have print books, I have to admit, I believe that there are workarounds now under fair use where we have the ability to scan things, save them in digital format, and control access to them in a way that respects the balance of copyright. What I fear is that going forward, these works are no longer sold to libraries. They're licensed to libraries. And you don't have the same rights under fair use when your use is guided by a contract, not necessarily by ownership or copyright. And at that point in time, we are really at the mercy, I think, of the vendors to determine what to save, how to save it, and where to save it. So I think that's where my concern is there. My last comment is actually a simple one, is just to mention a tool called PERMA, which was a partnership between Harvard and the Internet Archive to, I think, try to tackle one of the challenges that has been mentioned here, which is link rot or reference rot. So this is a tool that's now being used, I believe, by academics to preserve all URLs in journal articles in a permanent form. So even if that URL disappears, even if that document disappears from that location, it has now been preserved in the Internet Archive. And that's just a tool that I wanted to mention out there because I believe that use of that is spreading beyond law schools, which is where it started. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. So let me take that last point. One of the things that Brewster Kahle does when he is pulling pages off of the World Wide Web is that he rewrites the URLs so that they resolve locally inside the Internet Archive, and that's the only way that he can assure that you don't get page 404. He did something else, though, that's kind of interesting. He created a plugin for the Chrome browser, and if you get page 404 not found, it will, if you put this plugin into the browser, it will automatically go to the Internet Archive and see if it can find a snapshot of the particular thing you were looking for. And I've now triggered that fairly often, I have to say, more than I like.
I believe he's also working on a tool to work with Wikimedia so that it will scan all the links that are in Wikipedia or any of the other Wikimedia pages and find out which links are broken and replace them, automatically edit
Wow,
them. So
that's
that
very
they're done.
impressive.
So I believe he's working on that as well.
So one of the peculiar things about using the World Wide Web is that you have the impression that everything is in it. And in fact, what is there is only what is there. And even though it feels like, because last week you got a hold of something, so isn't it still there? And the answer is maybe not. But we get fooled into thinking that everything is on the World Wide Web. My observation is that the Internet writ large remembers stuff you wish it didn't, and it forgets stuff you wish that it would remember. And unfortunately, you can never quite tell which is which. On the copyright, the point about contract versus fair use is a really powerful one. And I think what I would hope to see, remember the librarians fought for fair use when the Xerox machines or the other dry copy machines came along, and the publishers said, oh my God, we'll sell one copy of the book and then everybody will make copies with the machines. Of course, the fact that that was economically stupid is sort of beside the point. So the librarians fought for us, and I'm sort of hoping that we can amass an army of librarians to fight for whatever else is needed in order to achieve the digital preservation that we want. Now, there is one thing that both of your discussions resonated with me very strongly, and that is what you can do with digital content that you can't do when it's in printed form. All the processing that's possible to discover correlations, to discover similarities. Mike Whitmore over at the Folger Shakespeare Library is busily digitizing everything that they can in their Elizabethan collection, partly for purposes of being able to identify authors whose works are not necessarily known. Something shows up and you wonder who did that. Well, statistically speaking, you may be able to figure out if you know this author and style and vocabulary and everything else, you may actually be able to identify a new work based on correlations of style and things of that sort. And there are lots of other things you can do, which means I often end up buying both hard copy and soft copy of things. The hard copy is for preservation purposes, and the soft copy is to avoid carrying 1,000 books with me when I'm traveling on the airplane, which is most of the time. Now, there's something else that the social effects that were alluded to. Let me remind you of one. Once things become available online, things change. So, example, we believe that court cases and court transcripts are public information. But those transcripts have a lot of personal information in them. When you had to go to the courthouse and ask for a copy to be made and maybe even pay for that, the risk factor of personal information, inappropriate distribution was relatively low because people didn't go after those things. But once everything is online, then anybody can find anything and they can search for anything. And the result is a side effect. And so one of the things that I haven't fully internalized is all of the social side effects of the online environment. Now, I'll give you one more, which is not exactly relevant to preservation, but it's relevant to our, let's say, weak intuitions of the implication of new technology. When the Internet and the World Wide Web started to blossom, it was pretty clear that the barrier to access to information and the sharing of information was dropping to nearly zero. If you had a laptop or a tablet or something, or a mobile for that matter, you had the ability both to get information and to inject information into the system. On the surface, that sounded like it was a good thing. However, there's a variety of information that gets injected into the internet and into the World Wide Web, some of which is not doing us any good at all. That's because not everybody has the same positive motivations that most of the people in the room have. They are out there to cause trouble, to disrupt, to dissuade, to misrepresent, to misinform, and do all kinds of other bad things, which, by the way, comes back to the human nature point, which is it hasn't changed a bit, right? We still have people like that. But the internet has reduced the barrier to people's ability to cause trouble. And our ability to organize socially to cope with that is still, I would say, in its infancy. And I confess that even at Google, we struggle with that along with other companies that are online trying to deal with content that is potentially harmful to our societies. So this is a good example of engineers not being able to, or maybe I'll confess to being one of them, not being able to predict ahead of time what the side effects are of introducing these kinds of technologies into our societies. One other example, and then we should get back to our discussion. I recently realized that in my basement I have about 800 or so VHS tapes. And I actually had one of those VHS DVD players, and which I hadn't used in quite a long time. So I fired it up, and I stuck the VHS tape in, and there was a bing, and some little rubber thing didn't work anymore, and I can't play the VHS tape. So I'm sitting here thinking, well, I wonder what's on all those 800 tapes. Somehow I'm going to have to find out. So I went on eBay, and I found a VHS player for $80, and I had it shipped from somewhere, in New Hampshire. And I set up in the basement now, and I'm going through my VHS tapes. God, the quality is awful. I don't know how we could possibly have stood it. But some of them are historically interesting, and so I'm going to transfer them into something. And it's not clear to me at this point whether moving them into DVD is actually such a smart idea, given the fact that certain computer companies that will go unnamed have removed the DVD player from their laptops. And so, I'm sitting here thinking, why would I spend all this money to put stuff into a medium that I can't read anymore conveniently? So I'm not sure what to do. If there's anybody who has some suggestions about what to do with old VHS tapes besides burning them in the backyard after this session is over, feel free to come and give me some advice. All right, so now that we've heard from our two commentators, has that triggered anything over here? There's one already.
I'd like to add quickly to what Michelle said about biases. We are all very old. Everybody in this room is very old. And that
Watch your mouth!
That's a bias that will persist. So I once read a Wired article that was an explainer on how to use Snapchat. And that used to be a magazine for people who knew things, explaining a toy for children. And kids use YouTube now to do their research.
Yes,
and
they do.
And
They
that is
really
something
do.
that was a shock to me. And the people who are doing the accessioning and collecting, we will never know. I mean, one day the children will replace us, but they won't know what their children are doing. So I think that's an interesting persistent problem.
So I want to defend the kids who use YouTube for a moment, and not because it's a Google property. I didn't believe it either. I thought, what do you mean? Of course, don't they Google stuff? And they said, no, they go to YouTube. Well, why? Well, not too long ago, my wife and I, during the holidays, decided we would do a little cooking. We said, why don't we do Sichuan eggplant? Okay, so I didn't have any clue about this. It's got funny, long, skinny things that are kind of colored gray and what have you. So I went on YouTube and I typed Sichuan eggplant. I must have found 50 different videos showing you how to do it. And I thought, wow, no wonder these kids are so interested that they find out how to do things this way. I was pretty impressed by
That's how I learned to knit.
Yeah.
But speaking of that, if you think about what it is that we're preserving, that does present a challenge, because by the time we know what users are using, it could be that if we try to go back and preserve it, it's already gone.
It's already gone.
It's already gone.
So actually, this is interesting. This is a sociological observation that you've just made, which is coming sort of in some ways late in the game, and we didn't predict this. We didn't predict what, I don't think the guys that invented YouTube in the first place predicted that what people would be doing would be teaching people how to do stuff. I think they had in mind it was more entertainment, sharing of fun things. And yet it's serious business, and in some cases, literally serious business. People make money out of their teachings on YouTube. Okay, so yes, go ahead.
WorldCat.org is about 30 million records. Library of Congress about 6 million. What percent of the 30 million records in WorldCat.org have had full text done by Google? Do you know offhand?
I do not know the answer to that. And maybe does anyone else know? Anybody out there in streaming land? No, do you have an answer? No, okay, but you have a question. Okay, so I'm sorry that we'll make, why don't you post that somewhere and see what happens? How about Googling it? I mean, I don't know, I saw a hand up over there, but maybe not. Yes, right there. Yes.
I couldn't, I had a light right.
It could have been me. Hi, I'm Mike Godwin, and among other things, I worked as general counsel for Wikimedia Foundation, so I'm kind of alert to the preservation issues there. I just wanted to share a story which sort of underscores this issue. About 15 years ago, I did a public speaking event at Cato Institute, and they had recorded my speaking on a panel, and I thought I'd done pretty well. So, and I knew they had AV material, AV equipment there, and they were recording it, and I asked them for a copy of the presentation, and the tech guys were very reluctant to give me a DVD because it was digital, and they thought that was particularly amenable to some kind of piracy. I don't know why they cared about piracy, but they said, but we'll give you a VHS. And I said, oh, okay, that's fine. And of course, I took the VHS home and immediately digitized the content, and I no longer have the DHS, I no longer have a DVD player, but I have the file because I've duplicated it digitally on a bunch of different devices. And really, I think to underscore what you were saying earlier, Vint, I think obviously you don't want a monoculture in storage, you want a multiculture or something, whatever the opposite of a monoculture is. And I think the other thing is redundancy. But in addition to that, and this is one of the things I like about a Neil Stevenson novel that you may have read, Anathem, which is that you also maybe have to have a kind of a quasi-religious commitment to preservation.
Yes.
You have to have a social consensus behind preservation, because it doesn't matter if you have governments that can do it or religions that can do it. You have to have a social commitment that preservation is a good thing.
Yeah, I know that I spend a chunk of my time every week doing backups in order to make sure that I've got copies. Even if there's being backed up into the cloud and everything else, I'm sufficiently paranoid that I also want my own box full of stuff.
Isn't that fun that we've architected a world in which you have to run your own DevOps to make sure that your pictures remain?
Well, that's one of the reasons that Brewster and I and others have been talking about a self-archiving web, is that we would like a technology to evolve to the point where the creation of a web page automatically creates its archival function. That would be a really nice outcome. Yes.
Yeah, hi, my name is Tina Iotis, and I come at it from a multitude of perspectives, legal, records, et cetera. But a couple of observations here. We have, at the federal level, 3 branches of government, and I think only 1 represented here. So we don't have the judicial or the administrative in NARA, because I think NARA actually is charged with making sure that records that are of historical import are preserved for the life of the Republic and are engaged in some digitization processes and are supposedly guiding, as best they can based on their budget, other agencies about preserving digital records. And so I wonder how the project is incorporating what NARA is doing, what the agencies are doing, and then to point out that the way our system is set up with acquisitions and working with the private sector, the public sector is not creating the technologies and the processes. They're buying it from vendors who are not necessarily interoperable. In fact, they have a business case not to be interoperable. Yeah. So just to comment on that bigger picture, that our tax dollars are going to pay for things that don't all work together, and NARA can't handle based on, and they're great people and smart people, they just don't have the money to handle all that. So if you can comment on that.
Yeah, if I'd like to respond. I'm not at NARA, but I've dealt with those folks over quite a long period of time. And they are indeed confronted with very tough situations. Somebody will hand them a disk drive That's it. I mean, no laptop, no nothing, just a disk drive. And they have to figure out what's the format of the disk, what versions of operating systems we're running on that disk, what's on the disk, how do I archive it, what metadata is available. It is the most nightmarish proposition imaginable. And here they are. Now, if we as a group, a representative of people who care about helping others preserve their content, their information, then maybe we can begin a kind of a bow wave of concern about this that ultimately affects business models. If somebody says, I don't really want to buy your applications if they don't have a preservation concept associated with it. If I go to this much trouble to use your technology to create something I care about, whether it's the family photos or important documents or my email or what have you, if you don't supply that part of it, I'm going to be less interested in your product. If that ever becomes a meme, perhaps that makes a difference.
And I do know some people from NARA are watching the live stream, so I'm going to wave to reference of the National Archives. But there is a robust community of practice in libraries and archives. So NARA is leading the way in some of these things, but some of the leadership comes from the university archives and public libraries, and we talk all the time, right? We talk on packaging standards, we talk on URL abstraction, and so while we have 3 branches, we have the Smithsonian, I think also is another enormous voice in this. We're friends, so we do share best practices.
And the last comment I wanted to make was about trying to capture over time all this massive amount, at least let's just use social media as an example. We have parts of our government, particularly the military and the intelligence community, whose job it is to be capturing that, analyzing it over time to find the patterns. And the question becomes, how does the general public then get access to some of that stuff that's been captured and saved for the purposes of providing our security? Just because so there are places that are using data analytic capabilities and capturing it because that's their day job.
So here's an interesting 2 problems that this little conversation triggered in my thinking. The first one is the reemergence of what has been called walled gardens. I mean, some of you will remember AOL as a thing distinct from the rest of the internet, or Prodigy, or some of the other systems. Those walled gardens eventually eroded because people wanted to be able to get access to information. Yet to the extent that we see a reemergence of walled gardens, anyone who is trying to do preservation may fail because they can't get access to the content, or there's access controls that limit the ability to reach in. Now, there's good reasons for that, and one of them might be a business model, but the other one might be privacy and the ability to control who has access to what, which leads me to another problem. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that you have material you wish to preserve, and mechanisms are available to you to do that, but you also wish to limit who has access to it, perhaps for a certain period of time or under certain circumstances. Figuring out how to express that and then how to actually enforce it is a really interesting and complicated proposition. And if you're an organization, whether it's a library or something else, charged with receiving the information and then executing on whatever the access control needs are, whether they're legal because of copyright concerns or they are personal because you wanted to limit access until 75 years after the death of everybody, then that's hard to implement. And so you can see how this problem gets more and more complicated every time. This is theorem number 206, which reads, everything is more complicated. And this one gets that way the more you look at it.
And I would argue that there's a whole slew of information that is digital that I don't think we will ever have access to. Some of it is for privacy reasons. Others of it is due to business practices or trade secrets. I mean, all of the analytics, the big data analytics that companies do, that hospitals do, Amazon does on all of us as we purchase information, that is never going to be available to us because that is part of their trade secret. So there will always be, I think, a subset of digital data that will not be available to the public. That may not mean that it isn't preserved somewhere by that company, but I don't think the public will.
Actually, okay, so here's an example. If there are lawyers in the room, you can check me on this. there's certain circumstances under which that which you thought was a trade secret becomes more visible. It's in bankruptcy court. If something is considered to be an asset, it's amazing what the asset rules are about, well, we're going to sell this in order to recover money to pay back the creditors. At which point, a lot of stuff that used to be trade secret winds up being more open, maybe not public, but
Right. And you're absolutely right in terms of like the buyers and sellers in that case. Absolutely,
yeah,
that gets over.
understood. Okay, I saw some other hands waving. Here's one.
Well, as a user of libraries and archives, and as a writer who uses the materials in libraries and archives, the one problem that I have is implementing persistent and unique identifiers.
Yes.
I can go with my cell phone and get good visual representations of the documents. But when I try to record audio, like pretend that I have my cell phone here and trying to record this conversation, I find that it's very faint, and I've gone on YouTube and looking for, and I find YouTube is a very good place to troubleshoot and learn how to do these things. But I don't know how to connect audio that I capture in the cell phone with other, like, photographs or something. So that's something I would want to draw out.
This is sort of like commentary, where I don't have a specific answer for you, except one thing that I have recently learned to do, which I didn't even think of doing before. I'm a Macintosh user, and one of the things that they have is the video playing software, which also allows you to do video recording. And so it turns out it's actually quite easy to pull stuff up on your screen and record while it's on the screen what you're saying about it. And so this doesn't help you with your mobile phone necessarily.
Yeah, and that's what I specifically had in mind is video recording. I can do that on my commentary here, but I can record the visual of, say, this panel very well, and even under low light conditions, but recording the speakers.
Well, okay, so actually the answer
difficult
is,
part.
in this particular case, you probably could, because it's a streaming output.
Yeah.
You could plug into that, that's going out on the net. But there's also, these are wireless microphones, right? So there is, wireless signal in the air. If you had the right receiver, you could capture that too.
Yeah, but I guess the biggest problem I'm bringing up is the unique and persistent identifier to have that, so that when I'm, that's, I don't expect that to be solved now, but I'm just bringing it up as an issue for someone who wants to bring content together and analyze and.
So, the movie industry has figured out how to do this. Have you ever watched a movie being made and the guy goes like that, and that's the signal to get started with the audio? That audio gets recorded independently of the video. And when you do a movie, you have this giant pile of audio tracks and a giant pile of video or film. And eventually you have to put it all back together again. And they have evolved mechanisms for actually doing that. They do voiceover, do all kinds of things. So all you need to do is get yourself a movie studio and you're done.
Yeah, and then use the time sync and geospatial information and all that metadata that's down in there hidden.
So as long as you're going down this path, I had jotted down one other note about other media that we are starting to experience. And now maybe it's timely to ask ourselves, okay, given some of these new media, what should we do about archiving? And I'm thinking of virtual reality and augmented reality. And we think about the ecosystem that's required in order to make use of these two techniques. Especially augmented reality is a really interesting one because you have to know where what am I looking at and where am I in order to fetch the data that's appropriate. And that ecosystem may not be simple to reproduce. And if our intent is to capture that over some long period of time and then be able to reproduce the experience, it's not at all clear to me exactly what all we should do in order to achieve that. And so here we are, we're about to enter into this period of intense virtual reality and augmented reality experience with people running around looking like Darth Vader with those things on their heads. And I'm not at all clear exactly how we should attempt to preserve that for future generations to look back on or experience in some way.
Yeah, thank you.
I think another difference between young people and old people are, I see some millennials in the crowd. Do you have tangible media in your house? Do you have floppy disks or no? Okay. I think
if you don't, do you consider a CD to be a floppy or not?
they wouldn't have CDs.
No. Okay.
No.
All right.
And maybe not even local storage, right? Like that you might have like 30 gigabytes on your local machine, and the rest of it's not.
Oh, well, I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have external hard drives, many terabytes of that.
I think.
But I keep worrying about the fact that the damn connector someday will no longer be the same as the one that, and it's on where should I stick this, I know where I would like to stick this.
Well, does that mean that the millennials...
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. We should get microphones over here. Let's get this gentleman, and then you're over here. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
You made a mention of gap of current knowledge past centuries, and she alluded to something that comes to mind, which is we're losing another information source, and I have specifically in mind the IEEE Oral History Project.
Oh, yes.
And what are we losing in people who are unfortunately getting old and dying with carrying their secrets with them, and that's especially in the technology era where we've been through, that's a lot of data that we're losing. And the other one about preserving records and mold and all the rest, I note with lament the Santa Rosa fires took out 100 boxes of the personal archives of Mr. Packard and Mr. Hewlett.
Right. That was a really horrible example of what happens if you haven't planned through that.
The data in people's...
What I worry about is that many people believe that digitizing is a way of preserving. And they didn't take the next a few thoughts about what happens to that digital record. We had a comment over here. Sorry?
The Apollo 11.
Yeah. Oh, yes, another good example.
I was just following on to your comment about the millennials not having local storage, and it leads me to question, are they self-curating? Are they editing their own collections and editing their own stories, and that,
I think by and large, no. They think of storage as essentially free. But I think you were talking about, what happens to you after you die with your digital material. That's where policies and procedures for, who owns your Facebook account after you're passed, that kind of material. Who owns your iCloud, right? All of the photographs of my children and my grandchildren will be in the cloud someday, and how does that get passed on to the next generation?
So at Google, we actually have a policy that allows you to say what's supposed to happen. You can say, and we even have a mechanism for discovering that you're no longer around. You can set it up so that if we've not seen you log in for X number of months, whatever the number is you pick, then you tell us what's supposed to happen. Cancel the account, make the account accessible to the following people. Now, having just said that, think for a moment about the tricky problem about dealing with generations way far ahead of you, in your future. What if they don't have Gmail accounts? I mean, it's the end of the world, right? So there's a problem about how you identify the parties that you intended to have access to content, and that's still a kind of a partly solved but not fully solved problem. We've got a millennial over here who wants to say something. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that as an insult.
No worries. Thank you very much. So my name is David Marar. I'm a PhD student, public policy PhD student at George Mason. And I want to weirdly talk about being a young person. I think that it's important to understand the difference in mindset. I had a conversation with my father about a couple months ago, where we were talking about how I have Apple Music, and basically I was telling him why I like it and why he should join. And he's a almost 62-year-old man, born and raised and living in Europe. And he said, well, what do I do with all my CDs? And I said, well, you don't need them. You can just have access to them on your Apple Music. And he said, yeah, but what if I stop using Apple Music? How do I then get my CDs from there? How do I? So I think that it's true that there's a difference in mindset, and I think that comes to your point about human nature, because with the way that I perceive things, I don't anymore have. I think I have 2 or 3 CDs in my office at George Mason. That's also a product of me sort of moving across the world to come to graduate school in the United States. But yes, I think more and more young people in the newer generations are no longer thinking of things as in the physical space as much as they're thinking of, their digital personas, their digital areas where they have this storage. But I think that you're right, especially with specifically in music, moving into a space where you're no longer paying for the MP3 to have, like we used to have with Winamp and other such products. You're now paying for a subscription to go listen to stuff, to sort of virtually tag things as being part of your library. But not once that subscription, once you stop that, it disappears. So I think that it's important to also take into consideration the differences in perspective. So
this is a very helpful point. I also want to point out the differences in meaning for a moment. We use language to try to understand stuff, and we use terms like ebook without realizing that books of the printed type and books that are in digital form do not have exactly the same properties. And one of which is that you can't resell the digital copy so easily, especially if it's sitting in your mobile or something. Although I suppose if you had a CD, you might be able to resell that because it's fixed in the physical medium. So we fool ourselves sometimes with the language that we use, thinking that the properties of these things have been inherited even if they haven't. So I can't resell. It's hard to loan an ebook to somebody else, even though there are times when I would like to do that. So your point about people imagining that they have a plot in virtual space which belongs to them, but it's only theirs for the period of time they keep paying the rent. And so this is, of course, some business advantage to companies that would like to invest in something that keeps getting paid for on a regular basis. It's rent versus own. And I don't know whether anyone will ever get to the point where it's possible to own a piece of virtual space. It's a very interesting question. What would happen if the network were sufficiently pervasive that you could reasonably own and operate a piece of the web, a piece of the world of the internet? It's technically feasible to do that, but putting servers in your house doesn't always work well with the way the ISPs deal with bandwidth and so on. But the distinction is really interesting, and the question in my mind that I'm going to take away is whether there is ever any possibility that you can own a piece of virtual space and have any reason to believe it would persist.
But then going back to the issue there, even if you could do that, will users even be interested?
I think of that in terms of applications to serve certain media. So for example, I have a large photo collection on Flickr. But I would rather be running that software myself. I'd rather be running so that I know that it's going to be there in 10 years, the features aren't going to break. And I think, even if we can't run the whole, a whole subset of the network ourselves, but maybe distributed running of applications is a possibility.
Of course, depending on the medium in which your photographs are recorded, having them 10 years from now may or may not mean that they are accessible.
So we're actually at the 2-minute mark. We're almost at 2 o'clock, which
okay.
Time just flew, and this has been a
Wow, that
fascinating
went-
discussion.
that went
Yeah, I know.
very-
I wish we could keep it going, but so I just want to throw it back to our speakers and see if you guys have any closing remarks as we wind up the afternoon.
So, ladies.
I thought about your point about the IEEE oral history project and how important that is. And digital is less persistent than tangible, but meat is an even worse medium to write information on. And so the oral history projects at the Veterans History Center at the Library of Congress and StoryCorps, I think those are also great things to check out.
And I think my comment is there's so many issues. This is such a rich area to discuss, law, policy, technology, and I would love to just see that conversation continue across all industries until we have, if not a complete solution, at least a partial solution.
Well, I think that we can ask the Internet Society to continue sponsoring this discussion online as well as in person this way. I think my parting thought is something that I'm motivated to do is to find a way to make the digital environment as useful and persistent as its analog predecessor. And that, I think, is going to be a big challenge. But if we don't do that, we will lose a great deal of knowledge that we should be preserving.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much to Michelle Wu, Vint Cerf, and Kate Zwaard, and thank you all for attending. And please stay tuned this year for more events from the Internet Society on digital preservation. Thank you.